Today we're going to learn about one of America's foundational documents, the Mayflower Compact. First, a little historical background. The Protestant Reformation changed the religious and political atmosphere in Europe forever. Emerging nation-states of the 16th and 17th centuries, we're talking about France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, the Netherlands, they were consumed by religious warfare. If you were a religious minority in one of those kingdoms, you were branded as a heretic, and you were persecuted by autocratic rulers such as the king or a local prince or lord. And for clinging to their outlawed religious faith, many people lost their homes, they lost their property, they lost their freedom. In other words, they were thrown into prison, they lost family members, and some even lost their lives. England in the 16th and 17th centuries was no exception to this. The monarchy had established the Church of England about 100 years before the time of the Pilgrims and the Mayflower Compact. And in fact, because it was the King's church, it was the only legal church in England. Opposition to membership in the church was considered treasonous, again, because the king was the head of the church. So if you were against the church, that meant you were against the king. Now, a small minority of Christians in England who disagreed with church teachings fled the persecution, first to the Netherlands, then eventually they made off for the New World. These Christians were called Pilgrims. There are two groups within those that we know as Pilgrims. There were those called Puritans who wanted to remain in the Church of England, purify it of its unscriptural teachings. And there were also Separatists who saw that the Church of England was completely wrong and there was no way it could be saved, so they completely split or separated from the church. Despite the differences between the Puritans and the Separatists, the two groups shared common ground in that they both wanted to worship God in their own way, according to how they interpreted Holy Scripture. So, they fled the persecution back in England. They took a 66-day sea journey aboard the Mayflower, and in 1620 they arrived in the New World. The problem was they had been blown off course because of a storm, and so instead of landing in the Hudson River Valley as they had intended, Hudson River Valley, by the way, was part of the Virginia colony at the time, and it was owned by the king. They ended up landing further north in what would become Massachusetts. Well, the problem was the king had given them permission for a colony near the Hudson River Valley in Virginia. But now they were outside of the king's charter or the king's permission, and that was a problem. Their royal charter was no longer valid because they had landed in a new location. So they had to create some kind of an agreement about how they were going to live in this new land. Before they left the Mayflower and went ashore, the Pilgrims worked out a deal amongst themselves, a contract to which they could all agree. And this became known as the Mayflower Compact. And there it is, the original text. I'm not going to read the whole thing. You can stop the video if you want to, and you can read the whole thing, but I'm just going to highlight a couple of parts that are really important. You see I've highlighted these. They're in color on the screen. The first one talks about a covenant. We are going to covenant and combine ourselves together in a civil body politic. That's kind of old English language or phrasing for a group of people who are going to work together in order to come up with rules to govern themselves. And then you see highlighted in purple the reason they're going to work together. We're going to do this, they say, for our better ordering and preservation, so that we can have order and so that we could survive in this new world. Then the highlighted section in red says how they're going to do it. They're going to enact or create just and equal laws, laws that will apply to everybody equally. And they're going to do this for the general good of the colony. And they also say, highlighted there in gold, we promise to obey the laws that we create. That's critical. They have to be in submission and obedience to those laws. Otherwise, what's the point of having a law? All right, so let's recap here. So the passengers on the Mayflower form a civil body politic. Why do they do this? Well, to create order and to preserve or to survive. Do this? Well, they will enact, they will vote on, they will create just and equal laws for the general good of the colony. These laws would not be of specific benefit to individuals, but they would benefit everybody. In the Mayflower Compact, the Pilgrims drew on two established traditions of Western civilization. The first is the idea of the social contract. That's an agreement among the members of a society to cooperate for the benefit of society. Second idea was the idea of a covenant, a contract. It's an agreement which depends on two parties fulfilling the requirements of the contract. Party A says, I'm going to do this and that. Party B says, I'm going to do this and that. And the agreement stands because both parties fulfill the requirements. So what's the legacy of the Mayflower Compact? Well, it brought an element of democracy to America because they had to work out together what kind of laws they were going to have. And it was also one of the first examples of self-government in the colony. Self-government is a key element of our democracy today. Finally, the compact is important in history because of the idea that government is a type of contract, a covenant between two parties, the governed and those who are chosen to be the governors. And here's one last critical thing. A government to be legitimate, it must exist by getting permission from those who it governs. That's what it means here when we say the consent of the governed. This is one of the fundamental ideas that undergirds American democracy.